Hello, and welcome to Podcast Workflows. This is another Three Things in Podcasting. Today is July 12th, 2024. I'm your host, Joe Casabona, and here are the things that I want to talk about today. Now, it's called Three Things in Podcasting. I have a quick bonus for you. I started to record this video with a different story, and then I kind of started to poke holes in it, and I realized that there was something else that I wanted to cover. So, I don't know, you can think of this as like a number zero, but a study came out this week saying that YouTube is now the most popular podcast player among American adults. And I was reading through this is really interesting data, but some of it's questionable with any kind of stats. They kind of push this weird narrative. And there were 603 weekly podcast consumers. So I think for like Westwood One and Cumulus Media's reach, 603 is not a lot. I don't think. I'm not a statistician. If you are, feel free to leave a comment. But it is really interesting because it's showing that more and more American adults are at least listening to podcasts or watching podcasts on YouTube some of the time. I'll say like here, like 53% of those who listen to or watch podcasts on YouTube say they consume the same podcasts on other platforms. That's how I run it. I'll like watch a podcast on YouTube. And if I walk away, I will pick that podcast up again in my podcast listening app of choice, which is Overcast. I won't even like continue in the YouTube app. And I usually do that for sports podcasts. My favorite like Game of Thrones channel, Alt Shift X, has started doing their like 3-hour weekly live streams post episodes, which is wild to me. And then they do like a longer breakdown and they release those as a podcast as well. So I'll usually do some combination of watch or listen there. The visuals are really good for that. So if I can watch that, I will watch that. But that was a really interesting thing to highlight. The actual topics we're talking about today for Three Things are the podcast hosts put out their study about most popular gear. The last time they ran this was 2019, and there have been some changes. Earworthy has announced their first annual Independent Podcast Awards, and Spotify is adding comments. So let's get into this second story. By the way, all the links will be in the description for this episode, whether you're watching on YouTube or if you're consuming in a podcast app of your choice. If you want to subscribe to the newsletter and to the show, you can head over to podcastworkflows.com/join. Okay, so let's get into the actual first thing. What gear, software, and setups do 500 plus podcasters use in 2024? So I'll just say right at the outset that I said like Cumulus Media 600 is not good enough. The podcast host, while it has a great reach and does great work, doesn't have the reach of Cumulus Media. And so, 512 is, I think good. And they have some caveats here at the beginning. I would encourage you to kind of check this out. I think I want to do a bigger write-up on this because I took some notes here in Apple Notes, where I think, I'd like to write those things up. But some of the things that I have found interesting, 21% have been podcasting under a year. 7% have podcasted over 10 years. They do this weird breakdown where like these are the numbers here, but then like probably for statistically interesting purposes. Like, okay, here they show less than a year, 1 to 5 years, 5+ years. But then later on, they do breakdown. Oh, okay. This is the breakdown that they generally do. So maybe I missed that. Maybe like full disclosure, I got an early draft. So maybe they did update some of these numbers, but I didn't think those numbers were consistent. At least that's what I wrote in my notes. But it looks like they are now. So anyway, the big takeaways. Blue Yeti is the most popular podcast microphone. This makes sense. They've got like brand recognition and it's like cheap enough and it looks cool. And like old hat podcasters hate it, but there's a reason that a lot of people buy it. I have a video about how I don't think it's a good podcast microphone, but you can make it work. Samsung Q2U was number 2, and the Shure MV7 was number 3, which is interesting because the last time they ran this survey, the Samsung the Shure MV7 didn't exist. So it's really interesting that that has jumped to the third most popular. If we look at by experience level, less than a year is Blue Yeti. By the time we get to 5+ years, Blue Yeti is down to 7.2. I think this makes sense, right? 5+ years, I think it's interesting that the MV7 now beats out the SM7B, which is the mic I'm using. And it's probably because, like, when you're ready for an upgrade, the MV7 is great now. Like, it didn't exist when I bought the SM7B, but if I was doing it today, I'd buy the MV7. Like, there's no reason for me to own the SM7B now, and I would save myself about $250 or maybe $200. For 50% who responded, they are using their first mic. Previous, mostly upgrades from the Blue Yeti, which is interesting. 39% have owned their mic less than a year. USB is just barely the most popular. I guess it is the most popular if you combine it with combo. And then, again, like when you get to 5+ years, it's like an XLR mic. 30% don't know whether their microphone is dynamic or condenser, which makes sense because I think almost 30% have been podcasting, or 21%, 21 plus 18, so that's almost 40%, have been podcasting for 2 years or fewer. And if you're just here to talk, then, if you bought a microphone because it got recommended, I wouldn't expect anybody to know like if it's a dynamic or a condenser mic. 52% use an audio interface, which is strange since people mostly use USB mic. I guess if you probably combine these two numbers, let's see, we're looking at about 20. Okay, so like, yeah, it sounds like about this many people have XLR capability on their microphone. So I thought that was fairly interesting. Ordinary untreated room is most people. The more experience you get, the more treated it's going to be. More than 70% record with headphones on, which is great to hear. Even at less than a year, over half do. Like, that's just good practice. So I'm glad that that's sticking. And then some of the other things, if I look at my notes here, there's a lot of speculation in the article, which I thought was strange. Not strange, but it's like they try to draw a lot of conclusions. 6% of people were unsure about what mic they used, which I thought, like, how is that possible? And it's probably just that they used the built-in mic and they don't know. Like, it's just, that was weird. Most record in an untreated room. 30% record without headphones. That's a lot. 40. Okay, so one of the things that bothered me about this, let me see if I can actually find the spot in this, because video podcasting, they draw this super weird, is video the future of podcasting? Almost half the respondents chose not to add any video. No. Almost half the respondents chose not to add any video. That means more than half did. Right? So, like, they're posing this question like, I don't know if video is all that. Right? But then the data doesn't show the conclusion that they're trying to draw, right? I think, and I like the people at the podcast host are great. I know Colin, I know Matthew, and they're fantastic, and Lisa, and everybody's great. Sometimes I feel this push and pull between presenting data like this and the fact that they own a podcast recording and hosting platform in Alitu. And that, as far as I know, doesn't support video. And so sometimes I feel like the conclusion that, like, the growth of video is overrated, or video is overrated among podcasters, especially in their audience, is Not what we're seeing in similar stories like about YouTube's growth, right? And how lots of people watch podcasts. So that's the one issue I have with this study. But otherwise it's really interesting, right? Just kind of looking at how podcasters are using tools, and the podcast host has been around for a long time, and I really like the comparisons between in with like what has changed in 5 years, right? Most popular mic in 2019 was still the Blue Yeti. It's gone slightly down, but like the Blue Snowball completely fell off. The ATR podcast 2100 completely fell off. The Shure SM58 completely fell off. Samsung Q2U jumped up to second. Shure MV7 has jumped up to third. And built-in microphones are on the list now. My guess is that, especially with Apple's computers, like the built-in microphone has gotten better, and Descript's studio sound is really good. So that one's really interesting to me. Um, in uh, in 2019, 83% weren't recording video, 48% don't. Like that is way up. Like that is way up, right? Um Nearly a 40% jump in people who are recording video. So like you can't tell me that video is not popular. It's a really important aspect of podcasting now. So I think that's really interesting. Definitely check this out. I've spent a lot of time on this. I'll probably do a bigger write up because I do have a lot of notes here in Apple Notes, and I highlighted a bunch of interesting points that I just pointed out. One that was interesting to me is that newer podcasts are mostly solo shows, and longtime podcasts are uh, interview shows. So I thought that was interesting as well. But that's the podcast host study. Okay. So the earworthy. It's called. It's an unwieldy name. The Earworthy Indie Podcast Awards, 2024 Earworthy Indie Podcast Awards. So I'll just kind of point you in this direction. I love this. Full disclosure, I won the award for best business processes, which is wonderful. Really honored to be recognized, especially because Ariel Nissenblatt's on here and Danny Brown's on here. And who else did I see? Lindsay Phillips is on here. Really smart, cool people who are doing great things in the independent podcaster space are on here. But I love this because, as Frank kind of says here in the article, like a lot of podcast awards honor the New York Times and the Wonderies and the iHearts and all those podcasts with like a ton of money behind them. But indie podcasters often feel neglected, right? Like I don't have the money nor the desire to pay for consideration for an award, right? So I'm not, and like I don't have iHeart's money. So um indie podcasters are like the life's blood of the podcasting industry. And it's really cool to see them honored here. So I just wanted to spend some time here. Definitely check out Earworthy. I will put a link to them in the show notes in the description, because they highlight a lot of really great shows here. And in the coming weeks, they're going to do a full write-up on each show. So again, really honored to be awarded here for Best Business Process Podcast. I love the category, right? I mean, because there's so many business podcasts out there, right? Best Podcast Tips podcast, I love Best Americana. I'm going to listen to this. And that's the other thing, right? There's lots of new stuff that you can listen to. So, really great to see recognition of all indie podcasters for this sort of award. And again, I'm honored to be given an award in the first annual Earworthy Indie Podcast Awards. So definitely check that out. So thanks to Frank and everybody, the Earworthy team and the team at Lenny.fm who partnered with Earworthy to make these happen. Okay. Last one is a big one. Spotify comments. Spotify is adding comments to their app. So starting this week in the Spotify app, you will be able to comment on episodes, and then podcasters will be able to manage and moderate those comments in the Spotify for Podcasters app. I went ahead and I downloaded both, and I don't have them yet. They're just they're rolling out this week, so I'm sure it'll take some time. But I think this is great, right? So as a pull quote here, as a podcast focused on the lessons we can learn from history's greatest leaders, I'm always curious about which takeaways resonate with my audience, said Ben Wilson, creator of the How to Take Over the World. Comments on Spotify provide me with invaluable feedback, right? So this is, I mean, obviously this is the Spotify press release, so they're going to find a good quote, but comments are really important. They've been a long requested feature for both podcasters and Spotify listeners. Excited to roll them out. Podcasts have historically been a one-sided format, and they did offer some interactivity, but comments are a direct connection. I wrote a piece a couple weeks ago. I think I have an episode out about it now. If it's not out yet, it'll be out soon. About how to get good feedback from your listeners, because it's really hard to get feedback from your listeners. It's not like, I mean, we in the YouTube growth study, they say they stick around on YouTube for the community, the comments, and the other features. You just don't get that in a disjointed experience, right? RSS.com is everywhere, or I'm sorry, RSS.com. They are, I'm a contractor for them. I'm their evangelist. So I work for them. So they're always on the brain, I guess. But RSS, the technology, is meant to be everywhere. And because of that, it's hard to create a unified experience. And so it's really cool to see that in Spotify, whether you host with Spotify for podcasters or not, or whether you host with Megaphone or not, people will be able to comment on your show, and you'll be able to moderate and respond to those comments on your show. So this is big. Spotify is like in the Cumulus study, Spotify is number 2. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. Because Apple, while they've added a lot of really cool features to Apple Podcasts this year, if they don't introduce features like this that podcasters want a lot, they may be left behind. I think that there's something else to think about here because podcasting is a medium with RSS and it's an open medium, right? That shouldn't be behind a walled garden. I don't know. I'm not sure how to integrate comments into an open standard like this. In web development, we have pingbacks and we do have comments, and you can go to a website for those comments, but aggregating those comments is another thing. So, are we running into a situation where, much like social media, we're going to have to check every app for comments? Is there going to be a way for us to get comments into us? That's a big question for smarter people than me to try to solve. But I do like that we are seeing comments roll out on Spotify. So now 2 of the big 3 have the ability to comment on podcasts, which gives us a direct line to our listeners. And that is so important. That's so important. I'm really happy to see it. I'll probably be doing a full video on that when it rolls out. But for now, we have the press release. Again, I'll link to all of that in the description for this video. So those are the 3 most popular gear, Earworthy Indie Podcast Awards. Spotify's adding comments. And then we got the bonus, right? YouTube is growing in the podcasting space. They could be number 1. They're maybe number one among American adults. They're maybe number one among American adults for discovery. Either way, Spotify is growing. So that's it for this episode. If you want to get more of this sort of thing, as well as ways to save 12 hours a week producing your podcast, head over to podcastworkflows.com/join. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe and like this video. If you're listening on Spotify, leave a comment. And until next time, I'll see you out there.